Good day and welcome to today's webinar, From Acquisitions to Exit Strategies, What Every Family Business Should Know. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor to your host for today, Ms. Barbara Spector. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we begin, I just would like to run through a couple of administrative points. This is a 60-minute program, and we welcome your questions. Follow the prompts on your screen to type them in whenever they occur to you. My Family Business Magazine colleague David Shaw will be reading the questions on your behalf. This program will address the importance of strategic planning in family business M&A. Our speakers today have a wealth of information to share, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. Jonathan Flack is U.S. Family Business Services Leader at PwC, and Fentra Seagroves is U.S. Private Company Services Deals Leader, also at PwC. They'll be joined by John Neretlis, Family Council Chair at Roundtree Enterprises. So let's get right to it. To get us started, here's PwC.
Thank you, Barbara. And this is John Flack, and thank you, Family Business Magazine, for having us again today to share some key insights for family businesses to consider as they grow. A short bit about PwC. We have been serving family businesses for much of the history of our firm, over 170 years. That includes over 3,000 families in the U.S., and that's served with more than 2,300 dedicated professionals providing audit, tax, and advisory services. We like to share a lot of key insights that we hear from our family businesses that are top of mind, and today we're going to speak today about some activity within the M&A space, and we thought it would be best first to start with a snapshot of the current market, and then I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Fentra Seagroves, to pick it up from there.
Well, thanks to everybody joining today. This is Fentra Seagroves. It's an exciting market for deals these days. It's very active, and there's a lot of money in the marketplace. So it's really requiring family businesses to step up their game and to think creatively and to think strategically as they think about optimizing shareholder value for their families and the business. I'd say the market is still very strong. It's been the benefit of the rising tide of the economy, but there's a couple of things that have also driven prices, activity, and interest in transactions. The first is there's a lot of private equity capital out there looking for deals, an unprecedented amount. In fact, over $1 trillion. And if you look at all classes, including VC, it's probably closer to $2 trillion that's looking for a home. And as I always joke with my friends in private equity, they don't make a lot of money when that cash is sitting in the money market fund. They want to find opportunities to grow companies, to acquire them, to team with owners, and there is more supply of capital out there, and it mismatches with the amount of supply of transaction opportunities. So there's a lot more demand for those deals. I would say also that there's a lot of corporate cash on the balance sheets, and it's looking for a home too. Corporations are thinking about ways they're going to grow inorganically and have made the strategic decision that an acquisition is a faster way to create return on capital for their shareholders. And we see them with flush balance sheets, with a lot of cash, and competing with private equity aggressively for transactions. In the old days, we used to say that financial buyers were at a disadvantage to strategic buyers because they ultimately had synergies and cost savings, which would allow them to pay a little bit more. These days, there's a blurring of the line between the two because there is so much private equity money and, quite frankly, so many private equity investments that a number of the strategic buyers are now owned by private equity. So the appetite is voracious among all of those buyers. And these days, because of that additional capital in private equity, they have to be more aggressive with pricing, with their approach. So that creates demand for family businesses and parts of family businesses that are being sold, but it also increases the competition. So when family businesses are looking at acquisitions, there's a lot more competition and sophisticated competition looking for transactions. So one of the things that we get our clients to focus on as they start to think about the way they're going to grow inorganically is their M&A strategy. David, I think you're going to take a poll.
I have just posed the question. When you see it appear on your screen, please click the answer that you have, and we'll come back soon with the results.
Great. One of the most important things that we're going to talk about today is being disciplined. We want to make sure that our clients are not reactive to the market. We want them to be proactive. And that means they're going to be proactive as they design their strategy, as they think about their inorganic strategies and growth, inorganic growth, as they think about an acquisition and the process and the divestiture process of things that will allow them to reallocate capital. John, I'd like for you to make a comment here on your business, your family business, and how you guys thought about M&A strategy.
Well, we were, and we'll get to the poll result. We were, 10 years ago in the talked about, but nothing was really documented. But we knew that something had to happen. The family had been in the business for 40 or 50 years. We were in automotive retail, and just based on age of the principals and what was going on, we knew something had to happen. So just there was rational discussion around what was going on in the automotive business, and we also had a lot of real estate at the time. And in the Toronto market, we looked at it, and it was almost time to get out of automotive, and that was kind of what G1 was looking at. But it wasn't like a sit-down strategy discussion. These were discussions that definitely were happening at the business and within the family. How are we not only going to optimize our portfolio going forward in the business, but how are we going to optimize, getting family optimization out of it as well?
That's great.
Yeah.
For the audience's knowledge, when he talks about G1, G2, G3, he's talking about Generation 1, Generation 2, Generation 3. So when you think about the shareholders and the layers of shareholders, we're going to reference those throughout this conversation.
Yes, thanks.
I do have a quick answer to the poll question before you go on. So just so you know about our audience with this, 18% have an M&A strategy in place. 41% don't have an M&A strategy in place, and 40% say, similar to where John and the Roundtree family were, we talk about it, but nothing has been documented. So I'm now showing those results to our audience.
Well, listen, that's a great place to segue to our next slide. And I want to tell the folks that have a strategy, congratulations. And you are part of, I'd say, the upper quartile, because most companies do exactly what everybody else in the poll results said, which was, well, we don't have one, or we have a process that's a little bit fluid and it's a little bit more reactive. The good thing to know is it's not that complicated to develop a strategy if you're disciplined, but it's the discipline and taking the time and understanding how to build that strategy that's the piece that's really the most complicated. And then actually executing on the discipline and the process is not much different than the way our clients run their operations, where they look to do system improvements, where they look to do commercial excellence, build relationships. They dedicate the necessary resources, people, and time to it. And an M&A strategy is similar. You've got to make it a priority. So we think about portfolio optimization. When you have such a robust market and you have opportunities to carve out pieces that might be more valuable in somebody else's hands, that allow the family to take some money off the table maybe, or reallocate capital to a growth area or some other area the family wants to pursue or the business wants to pursue, or re-emphasize organic growth because you want to move out of a business and you don't necessarily want to go buy something else, but you want to move capital to the organic growth. What we want our clients to do is not wait, not be reactive, but really think about the optimization, because this is what disciplined investors do. It's what disciplined strategic corporations do with their corporate development groups. They're always constantly thinking because they're on the clock in terms of shareholder return. Public companies are public. They got to show their results. Private equity clients are always trying to show their return on investment and increase the number of investors they have and their investor base and their success on transactions. So they're constantly thinking about portfolio optimization. One of the biggest things that we see as an issue with families is their lack of discipline around how they should go out about optimizing their portfolio. How do they even think about it? And doing self-analysis is hard. It's hard to turn the mirror on you. It's hard to be patient enough. It's easy to say, boy, I've done a really good job in this marketplace. I'm able to run my business successfully. You've got to be able to step back and say, how do I really holistically think about my portfolio? And given timing, how do I look forward and what do I need to be in and what do I need to be out of? And what we focus on, we get our clients to focus on, is capabilities. We want them to work on defining their strategic advantages, really focus on the capabilities, the things they do well, and differentiate them in the marketplace. What drives their value? An extensive PwC and Booz research, which we now own, the Booz Consulting Group, has shown that there's a materially higher rate of return and success rate when you do this to your acquisitions, to your divestitures, and to your overall ROC and shareholder value increase. So we get our clients to think about themselves on a matrix, right? When there are differentiating capabilities, we want to push money to that. We want to exit those areas that don't have differentiating capabilities, whether currently or in the future. And then what are those opportunities that have growth? We want to push capital towards growth and differentiating capabilities. And that requires a lot of analysis, self-reflection. In private companies and family-owned businesses, there's a culture that's oftentimes very different than private equity. It's oftentimes family or stakeholders that have been connected with the company forever, making decisions that are necessary for a successful portfolio optimization are often very tough to make, and they're uncomfortable. And also I'd say that it's hard to sell something and get rid of something when it's going well, when it's producing a lot of cash flow. But it's better to get rid of something and reallocate that capital when you can get the good price, as opposed to waiting to be reactive when you have to, or some cataclysmic issue has hit that you didn't anticipate and your business has been weakened and you go meekly into the marketplace and just have to accept what the market gives you. So, and we've found over time that, unfortunately, the culture of a family business oftentimes slows this ability to do effective portfolio optimization. So again, first thing is, let's be disciplined around developing a strategy. It's not that complicated to think about capabilities. It takes real self-assessment, capabilities, competitive advantages, and focus on transactions that highlight where you're heavy on the capabilities and move away from where you're not strong in those capabilities. So if you think about it, an M&A strategy is a real critical component of business growth to a business growth strategy for most companies. You're going to buy, you're going to acquire, you're going to exit, you're going to divest things, and the other options that might include non-transactional in nature, but they've all got to be linked back to your business strategy, and ultimately they've got to be weighed against organic growth alternatives, because within a family business, capital is limited. And there is so much capital out there that finding a partner to think about how you optimize your portfolio is an opportunity these days. To find a growth partner who might be able to take a business to the next level. We have a lot of businesses, a lot of family businesses that want to stay in a certain market. They just feel like the next step has to go with somebody with more capital and expertise. So there's a lot of creativity in the marketplace as well. And you don't just have to be thinking about investing and selling. We think there's also a variety of things such as partnerships, other structures, alternatives to the build or buy choice. And why those are really exciting is that some of them provide you with cash-free options, right? So we have a lot of clients thinking about joint ventures and thinking about other options that strategic alliances, IP ventures, teaming. We have a lot of things that offer growth that are not organic, but inorganic options, but that create optionality to the classic acquisition or divestiture. Now, they require the same type of discipline. They can be just as complicated as a transaction, but they can offer a lot of flexibility. You're still going to have all of the typical things that happen in a transaction: cultural issues, asset issues, dispute resolution, concerns around management, who's going to be managing metrics, etc. But they do offer you some optionality as to your growth options. So if I think about that today, and we're seeing an increase in that, because in some cases, when cash was tighter, companies still wanted to take advantage of a window in the marketplace. So as you saw in the activity in the deals market, a lot of the deals represented in that growth in the market today were divestitures, companies carving out a piece of the business and selling it to a third party. But some of those were actually those companies carving that business out and putting it into a joint venture with another either competitor, another type of investor, another type of teaming partner that brought synergies or savings to the table, and they retain that ownership. And it allows them to create shareholder value with not necessarily putting money out at this moment or committing other types of resources. It allows you some timing advantages as well. I'd say the next thing that's just a classic part of a M&A strategy is the age-old acquisition, right? And in terms of this transactional approach, the first advice I give is even before I think about the specific transaction. I tell my clients, look, there is no linear relationship with complexity and the size of a deal. So a lot of my clients will say, wow, this is not a big deal. This is a smaller transaction. I don't really need to do a whole lot of due diligence. I know this business. I've known the manager for a long time. I don't want to discount the value of the gut instinct. In fact, most of my entrepreneurs, what separates them from the pack is not only do they have discipline, but they've got that special sauce. They know how to be successful in their business. So I don't want to disconnect from that. But in today's marketplace, where there's a lot of money chasing deals, prices are very high. And if you're going to have to pay a premium, that means it's more expensive to make a mistake in the marketplace. And if you take that discipline, if you take the discipline of, I've got to do this process, I've got to develop a process, and I've got to stay true to it, no matter if it's a $10 million acquisition or a $300 million acquisition, you're going to find that you've got good muscle memory and an institutionalized process in the business, and you're going to reduce the potential error for costly mistakes. Hey, John, what I wanted to do was get some of your insight around how did you guys think about acquisitions as you were going through your growth strategy?
So for us, Centris, we started with a divestiture to kind of free up some capital. And then it was, we were fighting a culture of someone who had not a disciplined strategy and had that gut that you were talking about for 40 years. It's someone who, in the 60s was a used car salesman, and by the 80s was, an owner of 14 dealerships, and always went to that, what was the gut telling him. And, it took a little bit of pushing from our non-family executive, our CFO, who's a brilliant young guy, and to try and bring some discipline. But there was still that the old gut of, I've made great calls in the past, and I feel this one is a good one. So we started looking at smaller companies that were growing, who needed cash and some financial management assistance, or there were people looking to exit their business in the near future. So the company took on a strategy of getting to know people because the companies were smaller, and just started getting into some really interesting products. We ended up in software, water purification, medical devices, taking from our car pass, we understood leasing, so we got into some B credit leasing company, a heavy equipment leasing company. And all these were all done with a partnership kind of provision. So they were, we'd come in, we'd provide financial management. That was one of our assets that we could do really well, as well as provide cash so that the company could grow. And we were also looking for things that had a kind of a five-year timeline to really get to the next stage where they had to be at.
John?
Yeah, that's helpful. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. John, you had a mechanism for discussing these issues within your family. Is that correct?
Well, kind of. I mean, we always talked about, I'm going to say, because we had been in, it goes back to almost a culture of, originally in the auto industry, it was always pushed that this would be the family legacy. Everyone was supposed to be in the business. Everyone was supposed to be involved. So when we started getting into some of the smaller companies, and now that we didn't have that auto business to fall back on, there would always be a small discussion of, is there someone in the family who could get into this? Is there someone in our G3 ready to move into a position in the company and move up to start actually leading it in the future? This was something that G2 had been driven into, our Generation 2, that they would be managers of companies. And I think out of before the millennials so if you take in the married, there's 8 of us. Probably seven of the G2s at one point had been managing a division or a company. And it was actually down to one G2 at this point. So even though we had kind of talked about not building a company around the family, there was always still that culture of, are we creating an opportunity for someone?
I think that's really important to hear about how you thought about diversifying your investment base and your portfolio. What you emphasized was what you were good at, right? Which was bringing capital, bringing professional management, bringing insight and experience. What you brought in as partners were the folks that knew the industries. And your success was figuring out what you were good at, leaning heavily into that, finding people who were good at what they do, and then finding the logical nexus of investment. And I think that's really important here. So if we think about the acquisition process, the first thing that we want to make sure our clients are focused on is being active in looking for things, not being reactive. I hear it all the time, family business saying, hey, boy, by the way, I try to meet with my investment banker once every 6 months, and he brings me good ideas. And I always say, wow, you don't want to be reactive. What you've got to do is go back to your strategy, go back to your portfolio optimization strategy. How are you going to grow? And then you've got to be what we call always on, always proactive in the marketplace. And we'll talk about that in a second, but it's a pretty obvious statement. So we got to be thinking about enhancing the deal flow opportunities, because you don't want to miss something that you shouldn't have missed that could be a real ROI generator for you. Then you've got to have the discipline to understand what you're doing. What is the risk of that? What are the risks of the marketplace? What's the environment like? What are going to be those opportunities where you can bring value to the table, whether it be managerial talent, will it actually be a good strategic fit? Let's say that it's a reduction of an operational footprint, so there's some cost savings. You want to do some high-level, knowledgeable due diligence around your portfolio of opportunities to narrow them down to a prioritized list. And then you wanted to make sure that you're doing a credible value analysis. It doesn't have to be a complicated valuation at this level, but it's got to be what's generally going to fit into your investment M&A strategy. Then you've got to think about the evaluation of that. And again, this is a discipline that used to be relatively special. I mean, private equity was not a big thing 20 years ago or 25 years ago. The concept of due diligence and firms like PwC doing due diligence was new. Oftentimes you just borrowed your auditor, you borrowed your tax guy to take a look at stuff. Now the deals practice in PwC is one of the biggest practices we have. That's because there's been a lot of specialization. That's because the basic table stakes of the market these days are excellence in evaluation. So where clients can really differentiate themselves, when everybody can hire a PwC or a Deloitte to do financial due diligence, where they can hire an HR firm or a special valuation firm, differentiation ends up being at the ends of the transaction. You cannot make mistakes on the evaluation. So you've got to perform your due diligence. You've got to link that due diligence directly to your valuation. Don't fall in love with things. Don't move to the shiny object. Be disciplined. Be able to say no. It's sometimes tough in a family business. Same thing when you're getting rid of things. You got to be disciplined. But where everybody's going to do that. There's so much smart private equity money in there, smart strategic buyers who have smart advisors. Everybody's doing the due diligence, and they're linking it to valuation, and they're looking at how do I optimize this so I win this deal. So you've got to link your due diligence to valuation, stay disciplined, but be comprehensive and focused on what matters in your business. And then you've got to execute, and execution is absolutely critical. And execution is not just you got to get the deal closed. You got to negotiate the right sales and purchase agreement. You got to make sure your risk is managed, your risks are mitigated as well, and you've got a post-close transactional plan. So you've got to make sure that all of your processes, from evaluation, from your understanding to your execution, that they're going to create a higher chance that you're going to be successful. So I would say where real value can be found is at the beginning and the end. And I would say a lot of my private companies and my family-owned businesses actually have gotten a lot better at diligence because they've realized that it's the core baseline in the marketplace. So they've gone out and built relationships with firms. They understand the need, both on the buy side and the sell side, but definitely on the acquisition side. So where's the value? Where's the incremental value? When you got to buy a company for a 10 multiple, 11 multiple today that was selling a handful of years ago for an 8, look, the market is what the market is. That's the value of that business these days. But for you to get ROI at the level that you used to be able to get it, you got to be that much better. So the first place that we really, outside of the execution, the transactional process, one of the places that we focus our time and our efforts is integration. And in an expensive market, this has got to be a priority. And you've got to start thinking about this in the targeting and the strategy time period. What are going to be the integration challenges? How quickly can you make it happen? And what's the risk that you don't achieve the level you need? Because I would say I've seen thousands of acquisitional valuation models, and most of them have a line in there that says synergies, and it's a filler. And I can tell you that ROI is a lot harder to hit. ROI targets are a lot harder to hit when you're not hitting your synergies and cost savings, or you're not doing it in a timely manner. We always talk about the time value of money. We want to nail those cost savings and synergies earlier, and we want to make sure we get them at the magnitude we assumed. So when we think about integration, right? Again, a disciplined process, a comprehensive process. There's a lot of stakeholders in the organization that need to be involved. Functional folks and business unit folks, and you need to be very thoughtful to run a successful project and achieve that integration target. But we want you to start early. It needs to start in diligence. You need to be planning and actively targeting items in diligence to help drive your integration, because your confidence in that integration is going to have an impact on your valuation. But you've got to be developing the plan and assessing what that future state's going to be and the risks and issues to that and hidden costs that may come on board as a result of that. And while you've got the, as we say, the engine out of the car of diligence, that's when you've got to really start doing the deep dive into diligence to the extent you have access to the target. And that's a great time, because it may be that integration creates a gating factor for you paying a certain price. But then once the deal closes, you're that much farther ahead to achieving those objectives and synergies from the moment you close onward. And that's going to help you maximize value. So you've got to make integration a priority. And quite frankly, some of my family businesses, when they're doing a deal, it may be their first big deal. It may be a bet the company deal. And I tell them, look, part of what we do and help our clients with is establish discipline processes. So it's all about embracing the fact that the complexities here are numerous, and there can be real value deterioration if you're not planning in advance of an integration. Because I've had plenty of deals where we have a closing dinner at closing, and then the real value that's going to be created has to start the next day, and there wasn't an effective plan in place. So if I think about the other end of the spectrum, we talked about it before, everybody's doing due diligence, everybody's doing aggressive valuation, everybody's trying to be responsive to deal flow. So where do you set yourself apart? Integration, where you can control the process, where you can really drive it, and being always on. That's really driving deal flow at an accelerated process. There's a real danger in the marketplace if you've committed to portfolio optimization of being passive. We don't want our clients to be passive, because then they're going to get the deals that everybody's competing for. They're going to be just money competing for a transaction. You want to build those relationships up front. You want to be after potential opportunities aggressively and early, and making sure you're thinking about how they fit. And then it's not your timing. It's not somebody else's timing. It's your timing. And you're going to be there, being able to be at the forefront of creating value for your company. And you may lose transactions. You may build relationships and they go off with another bidder. But you're going to capture a lot more opportunities that can create significant ROI. Now, I would say, as we think about the portfolio optimization, we'll move into divestitures. And when I talk about divestitures, here in this context, I'm talking about a family business actually carving out a business, right? So maybe they have 4 business units or 4 divisions, and one of them's a cash cow, but it's not growing, and they think there's a buyer out there who would pay a premium, and the family business thinks, I can reallocate this capital. But I would tell you that these themes are very similar if you're selling your business. So it's going to be very consistent. And I think it's a great time to think about divestitures and capital reallocations, because the values are so high. I mean, some of my clients are seeing multiples that they thought were not available in the marketplace before. And as we talked about, there's so much capital pushing that out. But carve-outs can be very complicated. They're not simply, hey, send over your business unit P&L and I'll write you a check by Friday. And they can be even more complicated to separate from a family business when you have the cultural, when you have the history, right? When you have the institutional knowledge across the organization, and you might underestimate the complexity there. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit here about some of the key points, and then I'm going to want John to comment on his discussions and thought about timing, because he mentioned it before. And people always ask me, Fentress, when's the right time to divest a business? And I say it's typically right when you ask that, but not when you think you have to divest it, right? So my clients typically say, I think I have to divest this now because there's some impact that's happened to that business, like it's now not performing, or they lost a key manager, or they lost a key account, or the market's a lot tougher, it's become commoditized, or it's harder to grow the business in certain regions. I think there's always a good time to get rid of something when it's less valuable in your hands, and more importantly, the longer you hold things that shouldn't be in your hands, the likelihood is that the value deteriorates. But I want my clients not to ask me when the right time is. I want them to come to me and say, we've assessed this and we think this is something we should exit now because we're going to be wanting to exit this in a couple of years and we can optimize our value now. And that gives us a lot of time to start handling some of the complexities and sensitivities that are needed from a private company carve-out. So the one real key thing that I want to kick off with is maintaining optionality. And if you've done your homework, you want to know your options, but more importantly, as you move forward, you want to keep those options, right? A buyer, you never want to have a situation where you've got a buyer who knows you're desperate to sell. So the earlier you can start, the earlier you can plan, the earlier you can test your hypotheses around the market, the better, because then it gets you a chance to assess your options and then decide what you want to do. It also allows you to minimize the assumptions you make that are wrong and can distract you or knock you off your path. I think about also thinking about value creation in total. And it's a subtle point, right? But it's constantly refreshing, turning that mirror on yourself to think about how you drive value. And sometimes it's not just who's creating the most cash flow in my market, in my portfolio of businesses or in my business. It may be what's the future going to look like, and that should be the view you're taking. But also I want clients to think about, hey, they may have a business unit that's worth quite a bit of money on its own, but what impact does it have to the rest of the company, right? Is there a strategic linkage? Is there an assumption that it's absorbing some of the costs? Is it going to be a complicated separation or a TSA arrangement? So you got to think about the pros of selling something and then the costs of selling something, and those can be intangible and they can be tangible. So again, the next thing, and we've talked about this a lot, establishing a flexible program, a disciplined program. How do you get yourself ready? And if you've got optionality and you know, boy, I want to potentially get ready to sell that business, or I want to carve that out one day, and here are the challenges I'm going to have. Here's how long it's going to take. When that buyer calls you up and says, by the way, I'm going to offer you a lot of money, you're not, hey, I'm not ready, I'm going to be years away. You've already thought about that. So you can assess it with an educated process. And I think that's really important. So once you get somebody involved in this and you've decided, you know what, it's time to carve something out and sell it, we think the market's good, then you got to think about where's the business been and where is it going? Because you want to create that story to the buyers. You want to create confidence in the future cash flows because that's what they're paying. And you want to identify them early so you can be articulate, your team can be articulate about them, and you want to raise issues of concern early on to strip them as leverage points from the buyer. And that's really important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But what I want to do is leave you with this key thought. Discipline reduces risk of close on the sell and value deterioration on the buy. Discipline reduces the risk you do a bad deal. So very quickly, we want to be deliberate on our stand-up activities and costs. How do you carve this out? You got to recognize that they're shared resources, but most importantly, I'd say in this is not only the resources and operational or reporting SharePoints, but also people. And that's a critical thing that goes throughout this. Is management is the most important. My joke is what are the three most important things that a private company needs to talk about? And it's management, management, management. A great management team can take a lesser asset and do wonders with it, and a bad management team can quickly run down a real premium asset. So you want to make sure your data is good. Buyers are very demanding in the marketplace. The standard is very high. Sell-side due diligence is pretty much a normal thing, but it's got to be gap focused. It's got to be accounting. It's got to stand up to what people would normally think about as an audit or something close to an audit, but it's also got to be normalized to think about cash and EBITDA and other metrics in the markets that are important. You got to manage communications within your organization, and that can be shareholders. So when you think about timing, when you think about process, is timing also right to tell the managers? Is there a flight risk? You got to get retention plans in place. You got to think about these things up front, keep it need to know, but then drive it forward quickly. And then my last point is absolutely critical. Pay attention to talent. Not only is the management of the business unit you're carving out to sell, that's going to be absolutely critical. And the better it is as a stand-up, the more likely it is that private equity is going to love it. And the more it's a fit-in or a shoe-in acquisition, then it's mainly going to be a strategic buyer or private equity-owned strategic buyer because there's synergies and cost savings. Regardless, talent and the consistency of that talent after close is important. But I'm also talking about talent to run your transaction. Everybody in your management team is going to have a day job, a night job. Your CFO is going to be burdened with running the business. And his organization or her organization is going to be responsible for responding to a massive number of requests. You got to make sure you put the right people in the right places to be able to respond, because you can hire advisors to help you, and you should when you need surge support, when you don't have that expertise. But ultimately, the answers and the responses have to come from the company. So talent at the business unit, make sure that's done early, and if you're an entrepreneur, you want to make sure you've institutionalized that value, that you have management that can go along with that, and they're viewed as running that business. And you got to internally figure out who is it important that I include and who is it important that I include in phase 2 that ultimately is going to be an important part of this. Communications are the hardest thing to manage in a private company. The word gets around very quickly, and you need to be able to manage that accordingly, because business disruption it's a negative in any of these types of operational efforts and growth efforts. Even on the buy side it is, because people get nervous. Now, so what's the story? And the story is, and you can see I've highlighted, John, I don't want to skip you. I talked about timing, about people, and the timing of not just shareholders, but how you thought about including people in the process. Give us some thoughts about that.
So definitely all your points there. I mean, I can go through all of them on how we were, affected by it. And we looked at timing, and it was the right time in the cycle. It was the right time in the marketplace for us to be doing it. It was the right time for the family to be exiting automotive. We just knew it. It was the right time for the family to get out. And going through the great thing, we had the option. We didn't actually have to sell. So we were able to take our time and learn as we were going along. We had moved really close on 2 deals, and all through that we did the learning process of what were people asking, where were our negative points, where could we improve if we did find an actual buyer and increase the value that we were getting on it. And it did. It took us about 3 years to finally close on the deal, and going through all those points you talked about were so significant for us. And then there's the other things, like who are, the business that we were in, your franchisees. So there's all these other kind of regulatory factors with your manufacturers that, we got to approve new buyers. So there was, that concern that every time you got close, now this person had to go and submit and figure out if the manufacturer would allow them to buy us out. So I can't emphasize all those points you had there. Yeah, they're going to come up. I think one of the key issues for us when we finally did finish the deal and what made our business attractive was the limited number of family members we had in it at the time. It was really, our G1 was the CEO, and there was only one G2 member in, my wife, who was the chief operating officer. So there weren't any other family members in key management roles. We had a professional management team running the business, and that is very attractive. It's extremely less attractive had we, a decade earlier gone to market with 8 family members all in key management positions, because what is the person buying? They would be looking at it going, well, I'm probably going to lose all these people as soon as the transaction's done. So, getting to that stage might take some juggling of the family when you're looking to sell, saying, you know what, we're going to have to make it that much more attractive by bringing in professional management to really sell it, if that's our decision going forward.
Yeah, John, that's super helpful. I would say, and I don't need to repeat these points on 16, but boy, absolutely right around the strength of management. And I would say 2 points here. Number one, what you said is very important. You want to institutionalize your value of the business, right? You don't want a high bust factor. And what we say about bust factor is if the entrepreneur gets in the elevator, steps out on the street and gets hit by a bus, the value of the business should not change, right? But unfortunately for family businesses, the entrepreneur is the driver, and the entrepreneur's family are the driver of so many things that are happening. So I tell my clients, you've got to institutionalize that. If you're going to separate something, you've got to be able to institutionalize it. And you got to make sure those critical drivers are not held or overly influenced by somebody that's in the family if they're not going with the business. And then I'd say my second point is that all of these things around the story are drivers of scarcity, of the perception of scarcity. When you're seen as a business, or the business you're carving out is seen with capabilities, competitive advantages, great family, great management, great human capital in terms of the staff, great IP, those types of things, all of those build into the scarcity value. And if you have companies that are very similar, if you can differentiate yourself with scarcity, you're going to get a premium in the marketplace.
Can I ask a question? How does family culture come into play if the family has a long history with the division that's being sold? Or, John, in your case, it's you had the generations in the automobile business, and you were going to exit that business. So how did culture come into play?
It's so, going back, and I think this is when I first joined the family, and I went to my first family meeting, and the line was, you will all work together whether you like it or not. We need to be more of, fast forward to where we are now, and it's more of the culture of pursue your passions and go and create your own success. And maybe there's something here at the business for you if you are successful somewhere else. But through the whole process, when you have someone who's built their whole identity around a business and their success, when you start to look at exiting, you're really challenging that person to look at themselves and say, do I still have a personal identity without the business, or does the family still have an identity? What about family security? We were all relatively secure with jobs, and now we're kind of moving less secure. However, the business becomes more secure. And how do you answer the questions for the next generation? And even though they were kids at the time, but culturally they were always hearing, well, there's always jobs, there's always something, and this is what you've been meant to do, and this is where you're going to go. And then all of a sudden that changes. So that really, that whole process was the impetus of having family governance and reframing our culture around that. But still, maintaining a professional business that is a family business, but the family business now thrives on the family's values, on the family's direction, but not on the family's hands-on management of it. So there's a lot that you have to get the family through, separate from the business, and that's, all comes down to governance.
Yep.
So John, there's a question there's a question from the audience here that is also relevant to what you were speaking about, John, because you talked about the 3-year time frame. When you're looking to sell, how frequently does word get out that a company is actually looking to sell, and does that damage its reputation amongst employees and customers? Evidently NDAs are great, but do they always work? So, did you experience any problems with that?
I'll address that first, John. You can chime in.
Yeah.
You've got what I'm talking about is a disciplined process that tries to prevent that. It is hard to keep a secret in the real world, right? And loose lips sink ships. But if you've got a disciplined process and you keep it to a need to know, I've seen a lot of success in managing those communications. But you're right, there is a major risk, and we talk about that, the risk of customers, the risk of clients, the risk in the industry, the risk of your key people leaving the business, right? Change is a scary thing. That's why we want you to be prepared, and it's a leading practice that we're talking about is preparation and discipline prevents leakage. Right? So if you're disciplined about getting your information ready and you're ready to move, when you're ready to sell and you've prepared for your sell-side due diligence, you know what the buyers are going to be looking at. You know what the questions are going to be. You know who the buyers are going to be. You know the risks with your customers and you know the risks of your employees. And you keep it to an optimal process. You've reduced the risk of something like that happening early on in the process. And it keeps your optionality to stop a process if you do get started and it doesn't look like it's going the right way, because there can be an issue with valuation. You may say, I thought I was going to get $20 million and I'm not going to get it. I'm only going to get $10 million, and you want to stop. But the question is a very good one. That is a big risk. It's a market disruption. It's an industry disruption. It's a customer disruption. It's a management disruption. It's a family disruption that John talked about. And I would say that another point that I get asked all the time is, Fentress, why is there oftentimes a difference between what my client thinks they're worth and what they actually are worth in the marketplace? And I usually say, well, the first thing they're doing is they're hearing about a deal that somebody in their industry did, and they're immediately thinking we're the exact same. Or I'm carving out a business and I'm selling it similar to what my friend John sent, and he heard about it at the country club of the value they got. Number two, and by the way, businesses aren't the same. They're good reference points, but they're not the same in terms of multiple valuations. The second thing is multiples that you hear about are based on a profitability and a growth rate that oftentimes you don't know about in the private company space. Those aren't public numbers, right? So there's a little bit of a black box going on, and our clients think, wow, I made $10 million last year. But when you actually go to a diligence process and a buyer looks at it and they add back certain things and they subtract things, they add back one-time events and they subtract additional costs that may come in, they may have actually only made $7 million in the eyes of a buyer, and if there's a 10 multiple, all of a sudden you're down from 100 million to 70 million, and that's exacerbated when there are diligence issues that the seller didn't prepare for. Right? There was no disciplined process. They allowed a buyer to come in without that preparation. The buyer found what's wrong or what's interesting or what could impact valuation negatively, and now they've got the leverage. And that's where that question comes in really well. What you don't want to do is now the word has gotten out into the marketplace, or the shareholders have said, you know what, I'm going to get $100 million for this, so I'm all in. The buyer finds something that reduces the EBITDA, and now who has the leverage? When you have optionality, the seller has the leverage. But when the process shifts and gets closer to the expected close, now the buyer has the leverage because they know there's the risk of people leaving. They know there's the risk with customers. They know if they have optionality and they can walk away, that they're the ones who won't be damaged. And that is the perfect question to kind of capture everything that we're talking about today, that preparation is the key to avoid value deterioration and to avoid, as much as you can, business disruption. So it's a fantastic question that really creates a synopsis of what we've been talking about today. So, and I know we're out of time, but I want to make sure that we just think about the leading practices we talked about. You want to create optionality. You want to create timing of your own. You want to manage the process. You want to stay in control from day one. If you've done your homework, if you've established your M&A strategy, and now you've moved to a divestiture, you want to be ahead of it. You want to control as many things as you can in that process as long as you can. And that's going to allow you to create scarcity. It's going to allow you to create the most value to allow you to make a decision for you and your family and the shareholders. Yes, this is the right decision, and you can feel good that you optimize that value. So you know the buyers are going to be prepared. You've got to be prepared, and that's going to allow you to stay in control throughout the process.
David, do we have an audience question?
Yes, we do. We've got some limited time. Any questions we don't get to, we will certainly provide to our speakers for answering offline. But related to creating value, with family businesses, there's often a strength in the brand positioning of the family. How do you see the strength of brand positioning, or maybe a lack of strength, playing a role in optimizing the value of a company selling itself? And what does that mean, or choosing an appropriate business to acquire? And what does that mean if family members, for example, or those who were part of the brand don't remain with the deal?
John, you want to take that first?
So yeah, definitely when you're considering, and I guess it just depends on the age of the business and the nature of the business, the nature of the industry. But we didn't really have that much family brand, specific to what we did. I mean, we were really dealing with brands, automotive brands. So our name on it really didn't have that much of an influence at this time of the market. I think 20 years earlier, we were definitely a family brand to be reckoned with. We were, one of the first, at the time wasn't even called an auto group, but that's really where we were at with 14 stores. And we even had our own school training salesmen, and even, every dealer across Canada was sending a salesman to train their salesmen. And, we were a real name, but 20 years later, the market had changed over, and auto groups were now becoming 60, 70, 80 stores large. So we were no longer really a brand unto ourselves. We ended up just keeping great automotive brands, and that's really kind of what made our business.
And let me chime in here. I think that's one of the hardest questions that family businesses have to wrestle with, because as I said, if the family members are willing to go with the business and they understand what it means to be owned by private equity and not necessarily have the degrees of freedom that they liked before, or go into work for a corporation where they're actually answering to another CEO, then great. I think that brand value for the family can work. I would tell you that usually the new environment is very tough for family entrepreneurs because of that degree of freedom, that degree of decision making. I think private equity can do a good job of empowering that, and that's sometimes a really good match where the family member, and maybe it's a generation two, says, I want to go out and do this. I'm going to go find some capital, and they're going to back me, and I'm going to be a true operating partner. Otherwise, if they're looking to maximize value, you've got to quickly move as possible to institutionalizing that value, making sure it's somebody other than the family that's driving the value. So when somebody comes in to buy it, they don't have to worry about the family going along.
We've reached the top of the hour, and I want to thank everyone for listening, and thank you, John Fentress and John, for sharing your insights and expertise. The replay of this webinar will be available for everyone's convenience. On behalf of Family Business Magazine, PwC, and our speakers, I thank you all for joining our webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks very much.